All right, we're going to continue on with our arm muscles here. So we've done the biceps brachii, we did the triceps brachii, we talked about how those are antagonistic muscles. Biceps brachii does flexion of the elbow joint, triceps brachii muscle does extension of the elbow joint. And now the biceps brachii muscle is not the only one that helps you flex your elbow. It has some other muscles that are synergists to it that assist with it. And one of those is the brachialis muscle. So I'm going to kind of rotate to a lateral view here and highlight that muscle. That's the brachialis over on the right side. Here's your brachialis over on the left side. So it's deep to the biceps brachii. All right, so if I highlight that one, you can see there's part of the biceps brachii, and right in here, that's the brachialis muscle. Let me deselect that one. So a lot of times that's all you see. That's your only view, when you're trying to identify this muscle from an image or a picture. That's what it's going to look like. You're just going to see a portion of it. Let me deselect that. Turn that off. Let me highlight the biceps brachii there for a second, and I'm going to strip that off. And so now you can see underneath there, deep to the biceps brachii, there's your brachialis muscle. And let's show the pins. So the origin is right in there. So it's going to be kind of along the middle part of the humerus. And then the insertion point down in here. Oops, I just brought my biceps brachii muscle back. All right, so here is your origin of the brachialis. The little blue marker there, that is the insertion point on the brachialis, and that's actually on the ulna, on the proximal part of the ulna there. So imagine, you can see how the fibers are running. Just like with the biceps brachii, this muscle is going to pull on the ulna instead of the radius in the case of the biceps brachii, and that's going to help you with flexion of the elbow. Brachialis winds up being a little more important when you flex your elbow like this, when you're not in anatomical position, when your palms are in the pronated position like this, and you flex, the brachialis is going to be more heavily involved at that time. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next one, the brachioradialis. Now that name tells you where this muscle, just like brachialis, that muscle overlies the humerus, which is the brachial bone in your brachial region. The brachioradialis is going to extend from the brachial region down along the radius. All right, so if we kind of turn our arm this way. All right, so we've already said right in there, that's your biceps brachii muscle. If you're an anterior, that's going to be the most anterior of these upper arm muscles. And then you've got the brachialis, that's deep to that one. And then look at this one right here that kind of runs almost like a snake from posterior to the brachialis. So it's running from the distal portion of the humerus, that's where it's attached there. That's going to be the origin. Let me turn on our pins. The origin is right in there. And let me scan downward here. Insertion point right in there, that little blue mark right in there. That's going to be on the styloid process of the radius, so over there on the lateral side of the forearm. So that muscle that kind of snakes along there and runs along the radius is called the brachioradialis. All right, origin up here, insertion down in here. So you can kind of tell this is going to be another one that is going to be involved in flexing the elbow because it's pulling on the wrist from up above the elbow joint. That makes sense. Another thing that it does is it helps out in supination of the palm. So let's say if you had your hand like this is actually in the pronated position. If your palm is turned toward the ground like that, if that's pronated. Supinated is like this, palm upward or palm forward if you're in anatomical position. So if you think about it, if you have your arm turned like this, where's your radius? Your radius when you're in anatomical position is lateral, but when you have your palm pronated, the radius is actually over here on the medial side. So if you think about that muscle that's running from over here along the radius, when it contracts, it's going to pull on the styloid process of the radius, that little bump along the side there, and it's going to help you turn your arm into in a supinated position. If you kind of look at those fibers there and how they run in that twisty direction. And there's another muscle called the supinator that you don't have to identify that helps the brachioradialis, or is actually the main mover that's involved in supination. All right, so again, there's your brachioradialis muscle on the right. Here it is over on the left. Now there are a lot of muscles in the forearm that you're not going to have to be able to identify by name, so be careful about which ones you're identifying. You know it's the brachioradialis because if you start over here at the biceps brachii and you go back one, that's the brachialis, and then go back to the next, you've got this snaky looking muscle that starts just posterior to the brachialis. That's your brachioradialis. That's the way to keep track of it. All right, and then if you hide that muscle down below there, let me kind of zoom in, right there, there's a deeper muscle, and that's called the supinator, and that's the main muscle that helps supinate the palm. So if you have it like this and you turn it that way, that muscle is pulling on the radius and helping to move the forearm in that direction. All right. Now, let me turn everybody back on here. Okay, so I've got my brachioradialis back on. And let's see, let me move all this stuff back over a little bit. We're going to zoom in. All right, brachioradialis right there. Let's turn that off. That muscle right there, notice how that is forming a crisscross with the brachioradialis. See how they kind of form that V shape there? That is called the pronator teres, and it is going to be an antagonist to the brachioradialis, and also your brachialis, and also your supinator, because it is going to help out with opposite movements. I'm sorry, it's synergistic. Sorry, it's synergistic with the brachialis, not antagonistic. Antagonistic to the brachioradialis, because the brachioradialis is a supinating muscle. The pronator teres, as that name suggests, is going to help you with pronation. So if you have your palms upward and you turn the palm like this, that's pronation. Or if you're in anatomical position, your palms are in a supinated position. Turn them that way, and they're now pronated. So that's what this muscle does. That's the main one that does this, and it makes sense that it kind of forms a crisscross with the brachioradialis since they do opposite movements. All right, let's turn on our pins here. And the origins are up in here, around the elbow joint. Insertion down here kind of on the medial side of the radius underneath these other muscles that you see here. So if you think about it being stationary here, pulling over here on the lateral side of the radius, that makes sense if your arm is like this and your origin is over here, insertion crisscrossing over to the radius. If you pull, that's going to turn the arm. That's pronation. Pronator teres literally means to turn toward the earth. You're turning your palm toward the earth if you're holding your arm outward like that. Also does help as well with flexion of the elbow. It's another one of those that's helping you with that based on how those fibers run. All right, last two. The last two, now there are a lot of additional muscles in the forearm, and we don't make you learn all of those, which I know is probably going to make you cry, but you can if you want to, but you don't have to. Now, in general, let me highlight this. All right, so that is called the flexor digitorum superficialis. So that is as the name suggests, that is a superficial muscle, so it's close to the surface of the skin, and it's involved in flexing the digits. So remember, flexion means you're bringing the joints, the bones come closer together at the joint if you were looking at it in a sagittal view, lateral view. So flexion of the fingers, you're doing this. You're curling your fingers. So if you look at this highlighted muscle here, zoom out a little bit more, scan down, zoom in. That muscle is actually here in the forearm, and it's got tendons that extend from, and all these stringier highlighted things here are tendons that extend out to the 4 fingers. Okay, and so when that muscle contracts, the fibers pull on those tendons and they cause you to curl your fingers. And so those are called flexor digitorum muscles. And you have some other deeper ones that are on this side of the forearm that are also involved in flexion of the digits. So all that we really ask you guys to know with regard to the flexor digitorum muscles is that on the anterior side of the forearm you have superficial muscles that when they contract they pull on the fingers, the phalanges, and cause flexion. So if I had an arrow to the anterior side of the forearm and said name the muscle that flexes, name the muscle group on this side of the forearm that works the fingers, all right, you would know if it's on the anterior side, that's going to be involved in flexion of the digits, so those are going to be flexor digitorum muscles. You don't have to worry about superficialis, just call them flexor digitorum muscles. All right, now over here on the back side, look what you have. You have an extensor digitorum muscle on the posterior side. So if you think about that, when that muscle contracts, it's pulling on these tendons that extend along the fingers. And if your fingers are like this, muscles on the back side of the forearm, posterior side, contract. They pull on the tendons, and that causes you to extend your fingers. So if I have an arrow to the posterior side of the forearm and say name the muscle group that works the fingers on this side of the forearm, just call those the extensor digitorum muscles. You have another muscle that works the thumb on this side. If I highlight that one, you've got an extensor pollicis longus. Remember, the pollex is another name for the thumb. That's a deeper muscle. Forearm muscles get kind of complicated, and we're not gonna learn all of those. All right, how about the wrist? You've also got flexor and extensor carpi muscles. The flexor carpi muscles are going to be on the anterior side of the forearm. Those are muscles that have tendons that connect to your carpals, and flexion of the wrist will be like this. Extension of the wrist is like that. Your extensor carpi muscles are more or less going to be on the posterior side of the forearm. So if your hand is down like that and you raise it, that is extension of the wrist. So if I have an arrow on this side of the forearm and it says name the muscles that work the wrist, on this side we'll say that they're the flexor carpi muscles, flexor carpi group. On this side they're going to be the extensor carpi group. Okay, and for example, I've got one of these extensor carpi muscles here highlighted on the posterior side of the arm, and it's running alongside the ulna as well on the medial side of the forearm, and so that's going to work some of the carpals and cause extension of the wrist. And then over here on the front side, I've got this muscle highlighted right here in orange, and that's a flexor carpi muscle called the flexor carpi radialis because it extends over along the lateral side of the forearm. And again, the tendon that is connected to that one extends down and connects to some of the carpal bones and helps you flex the wrist. But you can see that's over here on the anterior side along with that largest of the flexor digitorum muscles. And if you strip those off, you've got other flexor digitorum. Here's a deeper flexor digitorum muscle on this side. Same deal over here. If we highlight extensor digitorum muscle there and go down deeper, there's an extensor pollicis muscle that, or pollicis muscle, I'm sorry, that extends the thumb. And then here's a muscle that actually abducts the thumb. So if you were taking the thumb away from the body like that, those are deeper muscles. You don't have to know the names of those, but just be aware that there's a lot more going on in the forearm than we're expecting you to know. All right, that finishes up the muscles of the arms. We're going to be moving on to the muscles of the legs, and probably have a couple of videos on those, and that'll finish up the muscular system anatomy.